The question is, when did the hijacking actually take place? And I would argue that it did not take place in 1996. The hijacking took place in 1987. The last time we faced roughly a crisis of the kind of order we're facing today was in South Africa in 1987, not necessarily in the rest of the world. That crisis posed the question of who was going to rule society. And I think the working class from 1976 already, gathering momentum through the birth of COSATU in 79, the emergence of the UDF or the birth of COSATU in 1985, the emergence of the UDF just before then, those were particularly crucial moments in the build-up of the revolutionary crisis. My suspicion is that we're going to see many such crises throughout the world in the coming period, and I take issue with this in terms of the question of power. The ruling class is powerful, it rules. If you're going to challenge the ruling class, it's going to hit back. It has centuries of experience of how to deal with the challenge. The challenge is not going to come through, or rather, we're not going to be successful if we're simply going to try to build up some kind of counter-hegemony over a period of time. I don't agree with how people interpret Gramsci. I think Gramsci had a revolutionary perspective. The SACP's two-stage theory was part of the hijacking. It created the illusion that we could have a democracy under capitalism. The result was we had written into the Constitution the private property clause. Prior to that, we had the pitching of the Freedom Charter. So any threat of inroads into private property, namely via the nationalization clause in the Freedom Charter, that was dumped in the early 90s already. I think we need to debate the question of context, because how you understand history also informs your politics. The same question that people have asked about Visha, the notion of democracy. I believe in a workers' democracy. We're sitting in a democratic space here, but by Visha's definition, I would not be party to the democratic left. I want to ask one last question, one last point. The public sector strike, I think, was highly significant. If there was a milestone, it was that. In the sense that what Vish would probably regard as the authoritarian left, from the ranks of the authoritarian left, you had a workers' movement that began to challenge its leadership in and through struggle, and I think that's an important lesson for the notion that the CDL is a milestone. I have reservations about that categorization.
The plight in South Africa, or the things that you went through during apartheid, you see, the problems that you had, you see, are a common experience, I would say, more or less everywhere in Africa, in every country in Africa. The issue of poverty, the issue of unemployment, the issue of housing, the issue of health, the issue of politics is everywhere in Africa. And I appreciate very much for this CDL initiative. I think it will be a solution to the whole of the continent of Africa. You see, with the energy that I see in you, to focus much on South Africa alone, because as I'm saying, it's a broad issue, and I think this will be a platform for all Africans, actually, to go against the elites that oppress us all the time. Because if we look at our situation in Zimbabwe, think of the amount or the number of immigrants that are in South Africa. Those are the very same principles or problems that we were facing in apartheid. If we are talking about ANC, we've got so many graves of ANC officials who died in Zimbabwe during the time of apartheid. So you have also to accommodate Zimbabweans. So in short, we have a common problem in Africa as a whole. And I thank you very much for this initiative. And as we are saying, we want a united force to get a solution to the problem of the democratic left. I think this is the rightful platform. And if we can actually filter down to all our grassroots structures, not only in South Africa, but I wish that we also penetrate to all other countries like Zimbabwe, DRC, Burundi, Rwanda, Somalia. You know where the crises are in Africa.
And we've had very moving testimonies from grassroots movements here, and a very powerful analysis from Vish on setting the context. However, our context is not only within South Africa. And as a number of speakers from other African countries have pointed out, our context is Africa. And we have to be much better informed and engaged with the social movements in Africa and what is happening there. But our social context is also global, it's also international. And the crisis of international capitalism is not going to go away. They cannot solve their crisis. The way that capitalism constantly pulls itself out of crisis is by extracting vast wealth from the rest of the world, slaves and minerals and food and so on. Yeah. And there's a world of change going on now. And in fact, Europe is teetering on the edge. If Greece, a dozen different European countries are virtually bankrupt. Yeah. If any one of them, Greece or whatever, defaults on their public debt, there will be a chain reaction across Europe. And the core countries of Europe will also suffer because their banks have been lending to these other countries and their shareholders own the debts of these other countries. Now, it's already evident in Europe that the popular forces, whether in Greece or Madrid, in Spain, in France, 3.5 million people in France demonstrated a couple of months ago, in every city in France. This is not going to go away. For us, what does this mean for us? Who are these people? How are they demonstrating? How can we form alliances with them? Particularly over global issues of climate change and climate catastrophe, but also the economic catastrophe. The United States is more difficult, but there will be social unrest in Europe. Deep and extensive social unrest. The United States is more difficult. There's 15 million unemployed in the United States. Where are they? More than 100 cities in the United States are bankrupt. California, the richest state in the United States, is virtually bankrupt. The United States is indebted to China. The US is in crisis, and they are not going to be able to pull out of this crisis. Now, the question for us is, how are the crises in the highly industrialized, rich capitalist countries going to impact on us? Negatively, politically, and climatically, and positively, politically. What is going to happen in those countries? And then the third area of international context that we need to engage with is what is happening in Latin America? How will the continuing crisis in Europe, most Latin American countries export to Europe. Brazil exports to Europe massively. Their economy depends on Europe. And their investment flows come from Europe, and the outward flows go to Europe, less so the United States. How is this going to impact in Brazil and the rest of Latin America? And the big question for us, China. Yes. So, what does this mean for us? How will China react or interact with the crises in the highly advanced industrialized economy and China's role in Africa? So, we've got an obligation to inform ourselves on all these external dimensions as well as the internal struggles that we are having to deal with. And this isn't easy. This is complex. But we cannot continue as if it's business as usual, and as if we can just focus on our immediate struggles, because these things elsewhere in the world are going to impact on us very directly, if in no other way, by destroying the global climate.
We are responsible for our own emancipation, absolutely. But we are not responsible for the capitalist project and its crisis. So I think these two things go together. In terms of the whole issue of how we liberate ourselves existentially, I think Dale and I are on the same page. There's a couplet here: anti-capitalist, but also for something, a democratic left or alternative. And hence that idea of a process of visioning from below and formulating responses from below. But I think that we must, throughout conference and beyond, reflect on this issue of how capitalism has imprinted on each one of us, how it has shaped our consciousness and our choices, our conduct, our activities, etc. And that's a self-awareness and a self-reflexiveness that will have to be built into our politics as we go down this road. It's not going to come out of a resolution. It's not going to come out of a declaration. But it's going to come out of a common understanding and practice. In terms of language that we're using to characterize this historical period and moment and so on, I think what's happening in Latin America is very interesting because there's an encounter going on between Marxism, scientific Marxist inheritance, but also an encounter with indigenous concepts of trying to understand historical change. So the concept of civilizational crisis is not necessarily a Marxist concept, but it's an important concept because it does point, I think, to a very, very critical historical moment that we are in. The stakes are very, very high. Economistic Marxist theory on crisis, overproduction, overaccumulation, is not going to help us put our finger on what is at stake today in the world we are living in. So I just think that it's important that, yes, we can adhere to our particular categories about trying to understand where we are, stages, this, that, and so on. But I think there's room for also some creative ways of thinking about where we are conjuncturally and in terms of the larger scale of things.